We are a company that looks at the pointy end of the spear in advanced computing. So for example, some of the three long poles in the tent this year for us are things like generative AI. What are some of the unique and interesting architectural features that are required to basically run a foundational model training session like ChatGPT, which could take months of compute time. We're looking at things like exascale computing, realizing 10 to the 18th floating point operations per second, 64 bits, is now costing north of $500 million a pop and consuming 25 to 50 megawatts of power, which is a problem in and of itself. And then, of course, we're looking at quantum computing. And the thing that ties these all three things together is the insatiable end-user demand for computational capability. You'll never find an advanced computing end user that says, I'm perfectly content with the computational capability I have today. I always want more. I can always do more. And I'm always looking for the next big thing. And that's really how quantum kind of breaks out in terms of the advanced computing end user community, which is quantum the next big thing to help accelerate some of the most vexing computational problems? Well, one of the interesting aspects of quantum computing right now is to really, we're looking at it not only from a technological and competitive perspective, but also to try to understand some of the dynamics of the market. And there's a real good reason for looking at the current state of what's going on in the quantum computing market. And there's really four different vectors, if you will, that this concerns. The first one being the quantum computing sector. The supplier base really needs to have some metrics. They probably like to know where the industry is going, what are some of the challenges and opportunities from a revenue perspective, how the market's going to break out, and really where the opportunities and challenges are going to be in developing and marketing and ultimately placing quantum computing systems. The other thing, of course, is the end users. They want to know that this is a stable sector. If they're going to write a check, if they're going to dive into quantum computing, they want to make sure that there's some stability in the market. The third element, of course, is the venture capital community. This still is not a self-generating, sustaining sector yet in terms of revenue to drive future development, to drive additional revenue. It's dependent on investment. And that's a critical element, and that's how showing where the market trends are can help make sure that those investment decisions can be made wisely. And the fourth element, which is becoming increasingly popular nowadays, is government intervention, if you will, government policies to support R&D, and increasingly government activities to support procurement. We're seeing a lot more interest right now in what's going on in procuring quantum systems around the world. And this is going to have a major impact on the trajectory of the sector, whether we agree with it or not. Lots of money is going to be spent by national governments around the world, ultimately picking, in some sense, the winners and losers of where the quantum technology is going to go. And so we want to make sure that all four of these different elements have the best understanding of the trajectory of the market, where it is today and where it's going tomorrow. And that's why we're really happy that Q2B, Quantum Economic Development Consortium, and the Korean Institute of Science, Technology, Information, along with others, have helped us put together what turns out to be our fourth annual Global QC Market Assessment. And the bottom takeaway here is it's really robust and on the rise. So I can go forward and just really jump right now to the executive summary. We're seeing continued strong and steady progress in the global quantum computing sector. We're looking at we estimate that this year the market will be worth about $848 million with a projected annual growth rate of a little over 22%, which brings us to a global quantum computing market worth about $1.5 billion in 2026. I'll give a little background how we got to those numbers in a minute. I just want to talk about why we're really content with looking at this relatively aggressive growth rate. We're seeing supply side growth in some sense driven by a number of interesting and complementary factors. We're seeing continued revenue growth by the traditional, we can now use the phrase traditional QC suppliers because the sector has been around long enough to say that the usual suspects are doing pretty well when going forward. We're seeing first revenue appearances by a number of new to market players. There's a lot of stealth companies, a lot of companies that have been out there for a number of years that really were pre-revenue, to put it most benignly, and they're actually starting to realize some revenue. We're seeing an expanding base of domestic suppliers in nascent markets. And nascents are markets are things that you would consider to be kind of non-traditional IT powerhouses. And what we're seeing now is a lot more interest from organizations that are standing up quantum computing capabilities in some of these nascent markets. And really what I think is most important and what we've seen here in the talks today and yesterday is increasing sophistication and specialization in the quantum computing stack. We're seeing organizations that specialize in quantum computing processor hardware, We're seeing lots of interesting things in terms of user-specific or sector-specific application development. We're seeing control system developments on the classical side to help integrate quantum processors into the classical computing environment. The stack is maturing, and that's opening up a lot of new opportunities for different organizations to throw their hat in the ring to really optimize the quantum experience for the range of end users. We're also, of course, seeing, happily, a concomitant increase in demand-side interest. We're seeing widespread interest in accelerating critical compute jobs. It's this insatiable demand for computational capability, where they're not seeing that in the classical world as fast as they used to see it. We're seeing more end-use case exploration within the overall community. It's amazing the amount of end-use cases, innovative uses of the existing state of quantum computing and its near-term expectations in terms of how can an organization take what's available and make some interesting computational gains from that capability. As I said earlier, we're seeing some sustained government programs. The National Quantum Initiative here in the United States was just renewed after its first 5-year success, and that's probably going to go forward pretty soon, pretty aggressively. We're seeing a lot of government fundings going on around the world. If you were in the one of the government tracks yesterday, we saw UK, Canada, the EU, and Australia, a number of important nations who are continuing funding quantum. As I mentioned earlier, what this does in terms of both fostering R&D and then related government procurements, that foster sales in the commercial sector by increasing credibility to the end users. There's nothing like selling to a respected government organization to get commercial end users to sit up and say, hey, this is something we should be looking at. So let me just give you some highlights of how we got to that number. We went out and talked about 133 respondents, representing 108 different quantum computing commercial organizations. And so here's some of the highlights of the things we found. Interesting enough, the quantum computing sector is taking on a much more traditional revenue-based financial profile. When we did the survey in 2021, almost half of the respondents we spoke to had less than $500,000 worth of revenues, and 32% had no revenues at all. If you fast forward literally just 2 years, only 27% of respondents had less than $500,000 in revenues this year, and 11% had no revenue. So we're starting to see a more revenue-based kind of composition in terms of the quantum computing sector. Basically, it was interesting, approximately 1/3 of the surveyed organizations expect at least a 25% increase in revenues next year. And interestingly enough, with the 108 organizations we talked to, not one of them anticipates a decline in revenue, which is a nice, comforting thing to know. Based on some of the analysis of the surveys that we did do, the hardware market for on-prem and cloud-based demands will account for about 30% of the overall market in 2026, and that equates to about a $470 million global hardware market that year. Some of the things that end users, that these respondents, remember, these are the guys that are selling quantum systems, that they saw as being the most attractive sectors. First one being R&D for quantum technology, chosen by about half of the respondents. And that makes sense. If you've got a nascent technology out there, the sector tends to consume its own product in order to enable and further their own research activities. But what we saw was an increase in interest in terms of dealing with the chemical and chemistry sector, which moved from number 4 last year to number 2. I think what that speaks to now is some more interest in advances in modeling and simulation at the molecular level, while finance drops from 1 to 3. Not a terribly serious drop, but again, it just shows that optimization there in the financial sector is probably what's driving that high level of interest. What's interesting, though, is we offered 21 different sectors to say, hey, do you think these are worthwhile? And what we saw was that some respondents within our survey of 133 respondents, every sector that we offered was seen as offering potential, as a top potential by one survey respondent at least. So there's a broad applicability here. What's interesting, and this was a capricious question when I started out 4 years ago, is there seems to be diminishing concerns about a potential quantum winter, and we're seeing the concern is waning on a continual basis. But we asked kind of a silly question, which was, did these organizations see large language models, things like ChatGPT and BERT, as being a potential distraction for quantum computing interest? It's a near-term, bright, shiny object in the computational world. And that was seen by about 40-something% of our respondents as saying, this could have some form of impact. It's a near-term, interesting topic that is garnering a lot of interest and can really add potentially a certain amount of computational interest going forward. So not that it's the end of the world, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind. So this is basically a chart that highlights the fact that this is our 4th version of this thing. It really shows where we started out in 2019 in our estimates and as we're moving forward. And I like having the 4th thing because, as I like to say, engineers need 3 data points to draw a straight line. Scientists need 2, and economists need 1. And so now we've got 4 data points here, which make me a little more comfortable. And one of the things I like about this is I think we're really starting to see the first visual representation of what could be an exponential curve in terms of quantum. I'm not a big fan of projecting too far out. I think there's too many unknowns in the quantum space. An interesting use case, an interesting breakthrough in error correction, or a new quantum modality that kind of breaks out front of the pack could change this calculus. But I think really what we're seeing here is some continued strong growth here that's relatively stable, and I think that serves all those 4 units that I talked about earlier in terms of this is a sustainable market and something that's going to be around for a while. Let me just give you some confidence building measures in terms of how we conducted this study, so you don't think we just pulled these numbers out of our a hat. What we did is we conducted a supplier survey to gather insights, and what was key here, and I have to thank these organizations, is we kind of got, if you were here this morning, to see the presentation to John Preskill, we had these organizations give us our certificate of authenticity. They went out to their members of their organization and said, this is a useful effort. Please participate in this. They're going to ask you some terribly invasive questions about what your revenues were, what your expectations were and such, but it's worthwhile to do this. And so these, the QEDC from the United States primarily, they have international membership, the European Quantum Industry Consortium, Canada, Japan, QStar, Australian Quantum Alliance, UK Quantum, and the Korean Quantum Industry Association all pitched in to really give us some validation to help us reach out, and this is how we got what we consider to be a good base of respondents. This is really just some of the demographics. North America, Europe. The key takeaway on the chart on the left there is geographic diversity, and the main products on the right again show the kind of breakdown of the kind of organizations we spoke to. So let's just jump into some of the things that we got from the survey. If you look on the chart on the left, this is the total organizations revenues. This isn't just quantum, this is their entire base, and you can see it's relatively bimodal still. There's a tranche of organizations that have more than $10 billion worth of total revenue, but there's an awful large group that are about 15 million or less, which speaks to the fact that there are some organizations that can fund quantum computing internally, don't need revenues, but there's a whole bunch of others that are still going to be dependent on venture capital, other forms of investment opportunities, as well as government programs. The chart on the right says, okay, let's zoom in on your quantum-related revenues, and this gives you a breakdown, but I think what's more interesting is if you compare these numbers. The chart on the left is this year's results, and the chart on the right was what we saw 2 years ago. And the big thing here is what I highlighted in my earlier opening, which was in 2021, half the respondents had less than $500,000 in revenues. That number has dropped, as has the no revenue number. So we're seeing more financial stability here. When we asked them about their revenue growth last year versus this year, there was definitely a trend towards increasing by more than 25%. Everyone seems to be lifting up their expectations in terms of where revenue growth is going to go. Now we can focus a little bit about market segments. This is when we asked these 133 respondents where they saw the market breaking down in 2026 from a revenue perspective. And you can see that quantum computing hardware to support both on-prem requirements as well as cloud-based activities equates to about 30% of the market in 2026, worth about, as I said, $470 million. CSPs will still be in the equation in some form or another, whether they are developing their own quantum hardware, whether they are a pass-through or at least a curator of organizations that are marketing their products through a cloud. And so basically they'll be somehow involved in about 48%, about half of what the overall QC market is going. Total on-prem based revenues worth about $485 million in 2026. I think the on-prem market is going to be much more viable and enthusiastic in the out years as there's more and more reasons for organizations to bring quantum computing behind the fence, whether they're interested in protecting their data, whether they want access to a machine 24/7, whether they're much more interested in tightly integrated hybrid classical quantum algorithms, or if the fact that the economics just don't work. Once you're really banging on that machine 24/7, it's cheaper just to have an in-house version than it is to go through a cloud model. This is an interesting chart because we asked about major algorithms by revenue, and you can see what we have here is consider the holy trinity of quantum computing. Mod sim, optimization, and AI are the big three as they always have been. And this, as I said, this is the 4th year, and this is the first year we've seen some deviation from that holy trinity dominance. And what we saw this year was the 17% of other. And we asked people, we said, well, what do you mean by other? And what we got was it's not that there's another universe out there of applications. It's that there's not a clean division anymore between mod sim optimization and AI. There's much more of a hybrid sense to it. So we think that's really what's happening here is the big three are still there, but there's a little more what's the best word for it? A little more mixing of those algorithms going forward. And we think that's an interesting development that we're going to try to keep track of. I asked a little bit about how in 2026 hardware will be accessed. No major changes from last year's study. You can see the little pie chart on the bottom right there as opposed to the big chart on the left. Really what it shows is that QC hardware procured strictly for on-prem will be worth about $103 million in 2026, but there's going to be a lot of additional on-prem hardware procurements needed to support hybrid and off-site cloud access. So again, the hardware market is going to be one that we think is going to be pretty relevant and pretty robust going forward. This is just an amplification of what I said earlier about the top three end user sectors, R&D and quantum tech, chemicals and chemistry, and then the financial sector. A little bit of back and forth, but the key takeaway here is the depth and breadth of this. Nearly every sector deemed important by some, crossing academic, commercial, and government spaces. Quantum is not a niche sector when it comes to end user division, if you will. We asked a little bit about anticipated quantum computing budget commitment. The big question is if you go into an existing HPC infrastructure, an ecosystem of merit, and you ask how much do you think of your overall IT budget you're going to commit to quantum, about 1 in 4, the largest group on the chart there, seen as committed to about 1 to 3% of overall IT budget quantum computing, but about 47%, about half of the organizations predict that about between 1 and 5% of overall IT budget will be committed to quantum. And if you think about how big overall HPC advanced computing budgets are, that's not an insignificant amount of annual revenues going forward, especially when you consider about 1 in 8 see it reaching about 10% or more. Compared with the 2022 results, which is the slightly less robust colored bar chart there, there was some movement towards less quantum computing budget commitment, but we don't think that's really statistically significant at this point. A little noise going on there. You know, the key takeaway here is that there is reasonable budget commitment for quantum going forward from the commercial space. We asked a little bit about end user perceptions. We said to these quantum computing suppliers, when you talk to organizations, what do you think their main motivations are for looking at quantum? And what we came up with was that if you look at the graphics here, there really is no single driver for quantum adoption. It's hard to say why the person across the table from you is interested in quantum. To me, the big one, though, is concerns with future classical performance gains. As I mentioned, exascale computers and advanced computing in general is becoming much more expensive. If you're looking at the highest end, the exascale range, it takes 4 years to design a system that may only operate for 5 years. It may end up costing you $250 million worth of electricity to heat and then cool the thing. It's a tough world out there. A lot of end users are looking for new ways to tap into additional computational capability. And just converting everything you have into GPUs right now is technically difficult. It's hard to rewrite a lot of legacy code to run on GPUs when you've been CPU-only Fortran for the last 30 or 40 years. And GPUs are just ungodly expensive. You know, let's be honest here. They're very, very dear to have, and the supply chain of GPUs could be a problem going forward. There's just so much demand for it, it's going to be harder and harder to get them. We're hearing stories about spot prices for advanced H100 GPUs right now being at about $40,000 a pop. Not insignificant. The other things we hear about is developing in-house user expertise. Organizations that have started to kick the tires on quantum, and they figure the best way to do that is to get a system, get access to a system, and just start having their in-house people examine what's going on. And then, of course, implementation of new quantum algorithms, the idea of quantum advantage, and some of the new capabilities that quantum brings that are not generally doable on a classical architecture. Another reason. Things that are drivers of less concern, reduction in power cooling and lower computing costs. Not that big a deal just yet. When the sector matures, those things are going to be stacking up when the C-suite starts to think about what's the return on investment that we're getting here. We're going to need to know things like cost reductions, time to market issues, and how much R&D this engenders from a commercial perspective. The quantum winter thing I touched about earlier, about 1/3 see quantum winter as somewhat unlikely. That somewhat unlikely is the highest level to date. That's 50% basically increase in the unlikely side since 2020. 42% are in the unlikely range, but still about 1/3 see some chance of a quantum winter. And I've just basically unilaterally described that as a 25% decline in investment that lasts more than 3 years going for the next decade. But as you can see, the general trend is shifting towards the left, much less likely viewed by a lot of organizations. And I've got 9 seconds to go. This is the quantum computing distractions And large language models, how likely is it? Large language models seen as near-term competitor for end-user interest in quantum computing by about 40% of the respondents. About an equal number say the same thing. But really what this does is there's two takeaways from this concept. It demonstrates the need for quantum computing to continue to deliver on technology performance gains. It has to maintain visibility going forward that says we're making progress. We may not have the system you want today, but good things are coming. Don't be distracted by short-term potential gains. And really what it does, the other point is it highlights perceived end-user interest in delivering performance gains. Anything out there that can offer a potential to satisfy some compute capabilities, people are going to grasp onto very quickly. And that, I think that's a cautionary tale for the quantum computing sector when they consider what their end users are like. Well, I went 40 seconds over, so here's some questions. We don't have time for questions. This is my email address. I can send you the deck because I went through it way too fast, which I always do. And if you want the deck and you can kind of mull over the stuff, that's fine. But again, thanks to Q2B, QCware, QEDC, and all the other organizations that helped make this fourth study possible. We certainly couldn't have done this without them. So thank you very much.